Many thanks for joining us on the program. I am Folashade Ogurinde. The Monetary Policy Committee of the Central Bank of Nigeria, CBN, has voted to increase the benchmark interest rate by 100 basis points to 16.5%, the highest since 2001. The CBN Governor, Godwin Emefiele, disclosed this while reading the communique of the last MPC meeting of the year on Tuesday, November 22nd, 2022. The MPC said the tightening would curb a higher rate of inflation and restore investors' confidence. To speak more on this development, Chijioke Ikechukwu, the Managing Director and CEO, Bristol Investments Limited, thank you very much for joining us. Now, what do you make of the MPC's decision to raise interest rates to 16.5%?
Yeah, this rate was expected, and we also expected, I expected personally that CRR was going to be increased just because of the aftermath of the announcement of the redesign of Naira and the fact that a lot of money was going to come into the system, and so they will want to reduce the money circulation by increasing the CRR. But that notwithstanding, the aspect of adjusting the MPR to meet with the current inflationary situation was actually expected, and that's what has happened. Now that it's happened, what we're going to be expecting is the fact that banks are going to be adjusting their rates, and their rates in the sense that people who have taken monies from banks are going to be receiving letters right now to adjust their rates upwards. And if that happens, that means money they are going to be passing down that particular burden to ultimate consumers, because there are already facilities that are already in place by these commercial banks. And what that means is that they are going to ensure that monies actually will just get into circulation and reduce as the case may be. Yes. So if we expect this to happen, there is also the fact that this may actually trickle down to costs of production, because a lot of manufacturers are going to borrow money and going to ensure that things are done. So we expect that cost of production is going to increase, and that is going to obviously affect prices of goods and services.
Now, the CBN has increased MPR a couple of times this year. Do you see this move taming rising inflation, as the CBN governor has expressed?
Yes, there are a lot of other reasons. Of course, first of all, you just know that this is a global situation. The inflation that we have experienced in the country is being experienced by many other countries, especially even the developed countries. And we have seen them increase their rates as high as we cannot imagine. And so these are all the things affecting the kind of adjustments we are having right now. However, there is also the flip side of it. The flip side is the fact that it is expected that investors are going to also, foreign direct investments are going to come in, because what it means is that you bring in your funds into the country, rates are going to be higher here. So even if you just liquidate any investment you have in other countries and bring it in, you're going to have a very better yield. So we're also expecting that direct foreign investments are going to come, and in fact, portfolio investments are also going to be here. And so these are some of the things we expect that will happen.
But beyond direct foreign investments, let's look at the manufacturing sector, which have, of course, over the past months, voiced their concern about the CBN, increasing interest rates. So in real terms now, how do you think a rise of interest rates to over 16% will affect this sector?
Obviously, manufacturing sector is going to have an adverse effect of this increase. I can see that many of them may not be able to cope with the rising cost of production, which is actually an additional cost on an already high cost of production. recall that we already have, high cost of power and energy. Buying of diesel has been out of the reach of an average manufacturing company. So if they build, many of them will not be able to cope with the increasing cost of production. So what it may mean sometimes maybe that some of them may just close down shop and ask employees to just go home. But for some of them that are very resilient, they are going to adjust certain costs and reduce certain costs in other areas and probably reduce their workforce in order for them to remain in business. For such also, we expect that they're going to pass down the cost to the ultimate consumers, who are you and I, and so and we continue to pay the higher price of existence in Nigeria. Of course, the quality of life and standard of living, quality of life is dropping, standard of living is getting high, and an average consumer is having to struggle for every purchase to be made. And this is actually part of the cost, the outcome of this kind of increase in interest rate.
Now, we've seen other global economies such as the UK raising interest rates with the CBN governor, Godwin Emefiele, saying as long as inflation keeps rising, the CBN will be left with no choice than to hike up interest rates. But is this just a textbook solution, or are there other avenues the Central Bank of Nigeria could explore to ensure that while interest rates are kept at minimal, inflation rate also doesn't skyrocket?
Yeah, one other way to ameliorate the burden without using just the monetary policy is just to also attempt to use the fiscal side, fiscal policy, and in fact the trade policy if need be. Having to say, okay, gentlemen, instead of you guys having to pay a lot for your goods and services, the fiscal policy is such that we are reducing your burden on taxation and you're removing certain debts you're owing and things like that. So there could be certain things that may be done. But if we continue to follow the monetary side, monetary policy side, it's only natural that as far as the inflation rate continues to rise this way, it is given that the interest rate cannot be far lower than the inflation rate as we have seen it. So somehow there has to be that much to be able to remain in business.
Well, Chijioke Ikechukwu, Managing Director and CEO, Bristol Investments Limited. Thank you very much for your time and contribution. Well, we'll take a breather here. Money Matters returns shortly. Just stay with us. Welcome back. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, has called on the Nigerian government to double value-added tax to 15% in the next 5 years from the current 7.5%. This is part of the recommendations offered by the staff of the Bretton Woods Institution at the conclusion of its 2022 Article 4 mission in Nigeria to help improve Nigeria's ailing economy. The IMF added that Nigeria can solve its issue of revenue by adjusting tax rates to levels comparable to the average in the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, as compliance improves. To eliminate red tapeism, it also called for strengthening interagency coordination and data sharing. To speak more on this, Taiwo Oyedele, Fiscal Policy Partner and Africa Tax Leader at PwC, joins me now. And thank you very much for joining us, Taiwo. What do you make of IMF's recommendation of a 15% increase in VAT?
Yeah, thanks. I think the conversation around increasing VAT rates has been on the table for some time now, especially by the IMF. They've always had the view that Nigeria's VAT rate is one of the lowest in the world, which on one hand is true, except that it may not exactly paint the right picture, because in many countries where you have the VAT rate at about 15%, You also have what we call the full input credit, such that when you buy assets in form of investment, you can get all the input VAT back. When you pay for services, you can recover your VAT. Essentially, the businesses don't bear a lot of the burden relating to VAT. Only the final consumers will do that. And then you have an extensive list of items that are exempt from VAT and those that are zero rated. In other words, the incidence of VAT does not fall on the poor people, it does not fall on businesses, and therefore is essentially carried by those who can afford to pay a little bit more. So that conversation around rates has to happen in Nigeria, if at all, along with the reform of the VAT system so it's more transparent and affords full credit like the rest of the world. And the timing has to be right because I have concerns that this time that inflation is rising and poverty, based on the recent data, multidimensional poverty is 133 million people. So it may not be the right time to start raising tax rates.
Now, how feasible is a VAT increase of 15%, especially when you consider Nigeria's current economy?
Yeah, to increase tax rate just requires government to amend the law. So actually increasing the VAT rate itself is not a problem. Government will just amend the rate. But if what you mean by it, whether it's feasible, is whether Nigerians can afford it, it will still go back to the question about how it is designed. So if today you're asking the person who is able to afford a five-star meal in a restaurant, where a plate of a meal will go for as high as 20,000 naira, you ask them to pay 15% of that, by all means, I'm sure they can afford it. But if you have people who don't know where the next meal will come from, and then they are trying to just have, maybe a bottle of a drink or a loaf of bread, and then you ask them to pay more. They can't even now. They are struggling to survive, so they can't give what they don't have. So what would then happen in situations like that is you push more people into poverty, inflation rate will go up, and then you may have to deal with social crisis. I'm hoping that government will take all of that into account and be able to use data and evidence in making the decision such that it is right for Nigeria, not just what the IMF or any other institution is recommending to them.
Now, by recommending a VAT increase, what do you think the IMF is trying to help Nigeria achieve?
Of course, I think the IMF, they are trying to help. So I don't see anything wrong with their recommendations. It's for us as a country to receive that recommendation and look at it from the lenses of the issues we are dealing with and localize it and see whether it's implementable, to what extent and in what format or shape or structure. So what the IMF is trying to help Nigeria with is that Nigeria has very weak revenue, such that the budget deficit for 2023 is projected to be even more than the entire revenue of government. And once you get to that level with the rising interest rate and yields, it means that it will become more expensive for government to even borrow. And the more government borrows at higher rates, the more the pressure on debt service costs as a percentage of revenue, which is already extremely high. So if you think about that, you say, where can you make revenue from? And how can you save on wasteful spending? And that's where the conversation about removing first subsidy comes from and raising VAT comes from. All of this is to help Nigeria improve the fiscal space, which if it happens, everybody will benefit. Nigeria's sovereign credit rating would improve, which means banks and private sector can even borrow at lower rates, which is good and necessary for investment, expansion, creating jobs, and lifting people out of poverty. So the overall objective is noble. It's just a question of how do you get there in the most pain, I'll say less pain rather, in the most affordable manner that does not create too much dislocation and does not result into social crisis.
Before I let you go now, what must the government do to balance the situation in terms of getting the needed revenue, but at the same time and not placing more hardship on the people?
Yeah, so all those recommendations by the IMF are quite predictable. So if inflation is rising, the textbook solution is you keep increasing interest rate, right? But again, context and balance is always very important. Within the context of the Nigerian economy, you're not finding the same impact when you raise interest rates as you find in most countries. The reason being that the economy is largely cash-based. In the developed world, people have mortgages, they have credit cards, and once you start raising rates, you actually see their mortgage repayments go up significantly within a short period of time. They see on their credit card that for every $1 that they spend, the cost of that amount goes up, and then they start making adjustments as to their spending. And then once demand and all of those purchases reduce, then you start seeing inflation moderating. But we live in an environment where 1.3 million people are poor. They don't have discretionary spend. So these are people who are just surviving, trying to find what to eat. So I have a lot of the cash in the economy is outside of the banking system. So I don't think that continuing to raise interest rates will solve the problem, especially when the same central bank is giving trillions of naira to government in ways and means. So on one hand, you're trying to mop up money from circulation. You're trying to make it more expensive so that people want to save rather than spend. But you're also sending money to government to spend. So that doesn't help in a way. And, ultimately, if you think about how can government raise revenue without complicating the economic situation, I'll say the first one is we have a significant compliance gap when it comes to taxes. In my estimation, about 6 to 8% of GDP is being lost in tax evasion and aggressive avoidance. So government needs to use data and intelligence to try and bring everybody into the tax net to pay what they need to pay now, not to increase the rate, but just get everybody to comply. Because if you increase the rates, those who are trying to do the right thing, who are compliant, will bear an additional burden. And before you know it, they might even become uncompetitive to play in the market where other guys are doing the same business, but are not paying taxes. Another one is harmonization. Today, you have over 63 MDAs, that's government-owned enterprises, that are trying to collect one form of tax and levies here and there. With high cost of collection, some of them using consultants, and a lot of inefficiency and sometimes waste and corruption. So why can't we just harmonize the taxes so that only Federal Inland Revenue Service collects all the taxes and levies for government and government agencies? That way they can bring the cost of collection down. Government can harmonize the taxes so they are not 60-something different taxes. They are less than 10. So there are things we can do, in my view, to raise tax revenue without necessarily introducing new taxes or increasing the rate of existing ones, which in my view is like the easy solution that government is trying to do instead of doing the hard work.
Taiwo Oyedele, Fiscal Policy Partner and Africa Tax Leader at PwC, thank you very much for your time and your contribution. And it's a wrap on the program. Many thanks for watching. I am Folashade Ogurinde. See you next time.